In one of the most efficiently governed cities on Earth, there once existed a place beyond the reach of law. It was a city with no recognized police force, no building regulations, no official address. Yet tens of thousands lived there. They raised families, ran businesses, and built futures. The city spanned just 6.4 acres, roughly the size of 4 football fields. Yet, more than 50,000 people packed inside, making it the most densely populated place in recorded history. To outsiders, it was described as a slum, a fortress of criminals, a monument to urban failure. But to those inside, Kowloon Walled City was not a symbol, it was home. Kowloon Walled City, a spot often pointed out as the most densely populated place ever, on the basis of numbers, never exaggeration. This enclave measured just about 2.6 hectares, or 0.026 square kilometers, and at its peak was home to a number of residents, estimated to be between 30,000 and 50,000. With a population density of about 1.15 to almost 2 million people per square kilometer, this defied all urban logic. To further understand how extreme this density was, Tokyo, one of the densest megacities, has an average population density of approximately 6,000 to 7,000 people per square kilometer, with its densest peak at around 15,000. At the time, Kowloon was more than 100 times denser than Tokyo's urban core. This enormous population concentration not only happened in the number of people, but also in the high-rise buildings, as city towers were built in increments, mostly without formal blueprints. The buildings were all huddled together, sharing walls and support columns, and having staircases going from one to the other. Very narrow, and sometimes less than a meter wide alleyways went around the buildings, while the upper floors were connected by bridges and makeshift passages. Yet, Tokyo developed through planned regulation, while Kowloon was compressing down and in, with people living in and above one another without interruption. As a result, the city was very dark, with sunlight barely creeping in at the edges. In fact, in some of the internal areas, the electric light was the only light. Density in Kowloon was not only spatial, but social, as families lived in units as small as 20 square meters, often subdivided further to accommodate relatives or tenants. Kowloon Walled City was not initially designed as a residential area. It rather served as a military outpost. The Song dynasty saw the erection of a small fort on the Kowloon Peninsula, which would later on protect the region's salt trade, an important imperial resource. This small setup became the basis for a future anomaly in world politics. The city's evolution cannot be understood without referring to the Opium Wars of the 19th century. China's defeat in the First Opium War, from 1839 to 1842, resulted in the conclusion of the Treaty of Nanking, which included the handover of Hong Kong Island to the British. The new territories were also transferred to the British by a 99-year lease in 1898 as a part of the Second Opium War. Most importantly, Kowloon Walled City was left out of the area that came under the complete control of the British, and thus it remained under the Chinese authority, which was then considered only a symbolic concession to the king's power. This exemption created a legal gray zone. Britain ruled the area around the walled city, but practically avoided taking actions with it, to avoid conflict over the issue with China. Chinese power, on the other hand, was very weak and occasionally only slightly enforced. A place governed by neither power thus emerged, a political vacuum. As a result of the conflict during World War II, the Kowloon Walled City lost its walls, which were then broken down and their stones used for the expansion of Kai Tak Airport. Japan's turning point made the area ready for unlimited construction. After Japan's surrender, Britain took the walled city back, but still kept a non-intervening stance toward the walled city. The Chinese Civil War, the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, caused a massive influx of refugees to Hong Kong. A lot of these refugees, having no legal housing alternatives, moved into the walled city. On the other hand, The residents took the opportunity to build higher due to no enforcement of building regulations. The low-rise residential cluster that was forming soon transformed into a thick forest of concrete blocks in no time. Kowloon Walled City had one inviolable law, and that was no building could go beyond 14 floors. This regulation was enforced because the city sat right below Kai Tak's airport approach, where planes flew low during landings. The city, unable to ascend any higher, opted for a more compact approach, thereby causing its density to increase instead of spreading it. The city was constructed in layers. Buildings on the outside got some sunlight and air, but going inward, the inhabitants found dark, common courtyards, which were the sites of daily living. Still deeper were the rooms where light never came and air movement was scant. These places were always wet, lighted by fluorescent lights, and filled with noises from machines and human activities. This population concentration caused the infrastructure to become overstrained. Water pipes ran through walls and ceilings, and leaking was a regular occurrence. Electrical wirings made up a network of branches and were clandestinely using the power supply of Hong Kong. Air circulation was scant, and waste disposal was sheer improvisation. Trash piled up on the streets. The sewers were connected only by trial and error, and there was not enough clean water, so the inhabitants set up their own installations of pipes and tanks. The stealing of electricity was an ever-present risk, but at the same time, it was a source of reliable power. There was contamination everywhere. Still, people learned to live with it. Kowloon was not a place of efficiency. Rather, it was the people who maintained it through their ongoing repairs, modifications, and support that kept it going. The Kowloon Walled City was a refuge for unlicensed enterprises, which numbered in the hundreds, among them factories for noodles, metal workshops, daycare centers, and slaughterhouses. It also turned out to be a center of dentistry. During that period, Chinese dentists were not permitted to practice in Hong Kong legally. Thus, the walled city was one of the very few places they could be. Patients from all over the city came to the place for cheap treatment. The consumption of dog meat also took place in the enclave, which was a combination of both poverty and cultural practice. These activities, though exaggerated by outsiders, were seen as a part of survival economies rather than moral decay. Living in the walled city was very tough, but it was also very social. The place was known for its roughness, but in fact, it was mostly peaceful families, workers, and small traders that constituted the population, all of them looking for a stable life. Children's education was carried out by informal schools, and in the absence of public services, the whole neighborhood was dependent on one another. Unofficial and improvised means of governing were established to keep the rightful order. The community organizations, religious groups, and local authorities settled disagreements and rendered services, like health and security, therefore, to a lesser degree. The triads that had been able to dominate the scene during the years between the 30s and 50s by extortion, gambling, and drug trafficking gradually lost their power through police raids and increased social integration. Tortures were nowhere near as general and widespread as the common belief, and the unwritten social rules quietly presided over the activities of the people in their everyday life. The residents of Kowloon Walled City had to endure very harsh living conditions. The population density was so high that it was difficult to get fresh air, and the sunlight was not enough, which resulted in the spreading of respiratory and skin diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy. Sanitation was an ongoing problem because of the lack of a formal sewage system, which meant that waste was being dumped into makeshift channels. Fire hazards were always there because of the illegal electrical connections and the closely built buildings that also made it very hard for emergency services to get to the place. The residents nonetheless came up with very creative ways of living, which were nothing short of spectacular. Neighborhoods got together to clean up, used the same source of water, and changed their living conditions in the house to make it airier and safer. Medical care, though not regulated, covered up the huge gap left by the state and provided low-priced care to the very poor who were unable to reach other healthcare facilities. The walled city was very poorly served with infrastructure, but it was still a place in Hong Kong that had the rarity of low prices and immunity from eviction. It was a compromise for the disadvantaged that was still the best available, where even under the most extreme conditions, life could be sustained. The transfer of Hong Kong back to China, which took place in 1997, brought Britain and China to the conclusion that the Kowloon Walled City would have to be taken down. The demolition was first made public in 1987, and the inhabitants were first moved out and then compensated. The year 1994 saw the complete dismantling of the city, which was the end of a period. The city was replaced by Kowloon Walled City Park, where select historical elements were kept, and the physical structure was completely eradicated. Kowloon Walled City still exists in films, video games, and dystopian imagery, although such representations are only partial. The environment was not just a pure dystopia or romantic utopia, but it was a difficult environment where the people supported each other, and through cooperation, resilience, and necessity, they built their lives. Kowloon Walled City was more than just synonymous with decay or disorder. It was a monument of human adaptability. It was a political uncertainty that gave birth to the city, which then became its own society, complete with its own social hierarchy, economy, and camaraderie, even in the place of great opposition. The city is remembered and portrayed in the culture as a lesson that, undeterred by the lack of official systems, people will always find ways to create a space they can be attached to and call home. Thank you for watching. This video takes a lot of time and care. Please show your support by subscribing and leaving a like.